My name is John Edwards. I am professor of religious studies at St. Francis College in Brooklyn and author of a new book with Fortress Press called Crucified: The Christian Invention of the Jewish Executioners of Jesus.
Dr. John Edwards. John, good to see you. Welcome to Exegetically Speaking.
It's so wonderful to meet you, David. Really
Yeah,
a pleasure.
it's a pleasure to see you, and we're having to do this by Zoom, but maybe face to face next time. Who knows? Maybe we'll be in the
I
same
hope so. I hope so.
place.
I've never been to Houston,
Well,
so
we've got to get you to Houston. We've got to get you to the Lanier Theological Library for one of our lectures or conferences or something.
I've seen pictures online. It's unbelievably beautiful.
It's incredible, and pictures just don't quite do it justice, right?
Yes, I need the smell to go with it. Yes.
That's the way it is. Hey, listen, for those who don't know you, how did you get started reading biblical languages?
I went to Moody Bible Institute and I took a class with John Lonsma, who I think is no stranger to this
Oh,
podcast.
yeah, he's our Wheaton-based director, right?
Yes, and his pedagogy is just unbelievable. He captivated all of the students. I think we all wanted to go and get PhDs. We all wanted to be just like him. And I, in particular, wanted to just I don't I was just fascinated by his grasp of the language. He was the first scholar I've ever met in my life. And he just passed on this infectious desire to know Greek, to read the New Testament in the original language. And that rubbed off on so many of us.
From there, what happened afterwards? You take more courses in graduate school then?
Yes, I went to Dallas Seminary and I continued to study Greek with Darrell Bach, and then from there I went on to the University of St. Andrews and got my PhD there, studying with Grant McCaskill. And I maintain my Greek every day. I read a little bit of the New Testament just to keep it up. I find that you try to spend some time in reflection each day, and if you just translate Greek to do that, you can kind of kill two birds with one stone.
Well, you can expand the mind and expand the soul at the same time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk today about Luke 23, and part of this really comes out of the book that you've written, and it's coming out. Well, it's out right now in October of 2023. And it's about the crucifixion of Jesus and how the Jews got the blame for it. So we're going to come back on another podcast we do, our sister podcast called The Stone Chapel, and explore that book. But for now, let's talk about Luke 23. What's happening, first of all, in Luke 23 that we need to pay attention to as we focus in upon verse 33 of Luke 23?
Yes, we do want to focus on Luke 23 and specifically verse 33. But actually, David, before we do that, I just need to mention something about the bigger context between our earliest gospels of Mark and Matthew and the various narrations of the crucifixion in texts from the second century and beyond. In Mark and Matthew, Jesus is executed by Roman soldiers. But in the retellings of the crucifixion from the second century and beyond, they always depict Jesus as executed by Jews. This would be like in texts like Epistle of Barnabas, Gospel of Peter, Melito of Sardis, Justin Martyr. And that might be a new idea for many of your listeners, depicting Jesus as being executed by Jewish characters. Now, this transition from Roman soldiers to Jews, it actually kind of makes sense if you think about how unhelpful it must have been to be a follower of someone executed for political crimes against the Roman state. So we think that early Christians felt the need to shift the blame to someone else besides Roman soldiers. Now, between Mark and Matthew and these second century narrations, we have, as you say, the Gospel of Luke, which is the first text to claim that Jesus was executed not by soldiers, but by Jews. So let's look at Luke 23.
Hmm.
In Luke 23, verse 33, the text says that they came to the place called the skull. There they crucified him. The question is, who is this they who came to the place of the skull and crucified Jesus?
Hmm.
Grammatically, We are asking what is the antecedent to they? And for some of your listeners who might not know, an antecedent is the earlier referent to a later pronoun. So, I mean, if I said the children went to the store to buy some cookies, they ate them, the antecedent for they would be the children. In Luke 23:33, we want to know who is the antecedent for they in the statement, they crucified him. And we actually have to trace back 20 verses to find it in Luke 23:13. Here the text says, Pilate called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people. It's this group of Jewish characters who are the antecedent to the implied pronoun in Luke 23:33. They crucified him. If we extract all the they pronouns implied in the verbs between Luke 23:13 and verse 33, the passage would sound something like this. And if any of your listeners have the text open in front of them, they can certainly follow along. So Luke 23:13, Pilate called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people. Luke 23:18, then they, that is the chief priests, leaders, and the people, all shouted together, away with this fellow, release Barabbas for us. Luke 23:21, but they, the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, kept shouting, crucify, crucify him. Luke 23:33, but they, chief priests, leaders, and the people, kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified. Luke 23:26, as they, chief priests, the leaders, and the people, led him away, they seized the man, Simon Cyrene, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. And then finally, Luke 23:33, when they, once again, the chief priests, leaders, and the people, came to the place that is called the skull, they crucified Jesus. So in Luke 23, it's the chief priests, the leaders, and the people who crucify Jesus and not Roman soldiers. And again, this is something that dominates retellings of the crucifixion from the second century and beyond. But Luke is the earliest known occurrence. Now, this reading of Luke 23 fits comfortably with the other material in Luke and Acts. If we think, what's Peter's dominant message to the Jerusalem crowds in the first 10 chapters of Acts? He continually says to them that they killed Jesus. Acts 2:36, God has made him both Lord and Messiah, this Jesus whom you crucified. Acts 3:15, you killed the author of life. Acts 4:10, Jesus of Nazareth whom you crucified. Acts 5:30, Jesus whom you yourselves killed by hanging him on a tree. Acts 7:52, the righteous one, you have become his betrayers and murderers. Acts 10:39, they, that is the people of Israel, put him to death by hanging him on a tree. On the road to Emmaus in Luke 24:20, the travelers report to the resurrected Jesus how their religious leaders crucified Jesus. Our chief priests and the leaders handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. We also have the parallel deaths of Jesus and Stephen. Both characters make claims before the Jewish leaders about the position of the Son of Man at the right hand of God. Both also make dying pleas for God to forgive the sins of their murderers. The author of Luke Acts intends Stephen's death at the hands of Jewish characters to be understood as an imitation of Jesus' death, also at the hands of Jewish characters. So to sum up, Luke's gospel is the first in a long line of texts that depict Jesus as executed not by Roman soldiers, but by Jews. This is a very troublesome piece of Christian history that most modern Christians are honestly unaware of. And I think it's just because we've all seen a Jesus movie or an Easter play where Jesus is executed by Roman soldiers, and that colors how we read Luke. We also might import the Roman executioners in Matthew and Mark into Luke without seeing that things have tilted and changed. However, I do think that our ignorance about this tradition of Jewish executioners is deeply problematic because it does leave a gaping hole in our understanding of what for so long was a direct underpinning of Christian persecution of Jews. And there's much, much more to be said here. I know this is a short podcast, so I just hope that I've piqued some people's curiosity and that they will check out the book.
Yeah, it's out from Fortress Press. Really fascinating. I have looked at this question. What's interesting to me, John, is that we talked earlier before the podcast about the Nicene Creed and about these other creeds where they say you're crucified under Pontius Pilate. That Pilate seems to be the one in those creeds that gets the blame, and yet we do have some very troubling texts, particularly second century and beyond, that lay the blame at the feet of the Jews.
You might be interested to know, David, that bit under Pontius Pilate isn't in the first Nicene Creed. It's added on, at the second gathering, and maybe it's not even in the first Nicene Creed because they were nervous about implicating a secular ruler, and Constantine was in charge of everything. I mean, there's so many things to
he's
think
calling
about.
the shots, right? Yeah, and the Apostolic Creed too, the Apostles' Creed. I think it has that same line. I'd have to go back and look.
Okay, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
that one.
but that's interesting because it seems like you've got a couple of things working here. I've got so many questions. I'm just gonna leave it at that.
Okay.
And let people be curious about it, and to think about how all of this context that you referred to, both in Luke and in Acts, because those two books are joined at the hip, how those two contexts help us sort of understand what's happening here in Luke 23:33. Dr. John Edwards, thanks for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking.
Thank you very much, David.
What a great conversation today. I hope you agree. Only 168 hours until the next podcast drops, so watch for it. Subscribe to us, rate us today. Come on, you know you want to. If you want to study biblical languages, and of course you do, you need to consider Wheaton College. They have the best program in the country, bar none. Go to wheaton.edu, look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. Thanks to those who make this podcast possible, Ian Rosine, Rebecca Larson, and John Lansma, who is our Wheaton-based director. Thanks to Phil Keggy for our music. Until next time, thanks for listening.